I'll be talking about clean and renewable energy and how can we take a systems approach to be thinking about geothermal energy specifically. The first system I'd like to talk about is a system of relationships. We can think about it in a formal sense with regards to the treaty system, but it also challenges us to be thinking about informal relationships and what that looks like. This is the sweetgrass bear that is in Quad, just outside of Cab here. Engraved on the side of the sweetgrass bear, it says, "We are all related." And indeed we are. So I would challenge us to think about how in our actions, in the work that we do, demonstrate those relationships with our other colleagues, with our clients, and with society more generally. Because of this, how can we then ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for everyone? And what does that look like? And really that's the work that I'm doing with my group with regards to how can we then deliver on that. We're doing that with the Future Energy Systems. This is some of the folks on my team, and it encompasses folks in geoscience, anthropology, in AILS, in mechanical engineering, petroleum engineering, economics, business. Because if we're going to really be thinking about how can we deliver safe and reliable renewable energy and what that looks like, we do need to take a multidisciplinary approach in that work. And that's really what we do in terms of how can we understand the reservoirs, how can we understand the wells and what they're doing, how can we understand the ways in which we impact people. Why do we need to do this? It's because renewable energy is actually being adopted at a much higher rate than we could ever possibly imagine. So this graph shows the International Energy Agency and their estimates on the adoption rate of various renewable energies. And you see the bottom line there, the yellow line. In 2000, it was a fairly flat line. They said, okay, renewables are going to be adopted at a fairly slow rate. And every subsequent year, they've had to adjust their line upward. In effect, it's not a linear adoption rate at all. It becomes an exponential growth rate curve. All around the world, folks are excited and readily adopting renewable energy across the board, and faster than we could ever possibly have imagined. Canadians as a whole agree that we should transition to renewables. So this is when we ask the question, how quickly should we adopt them? 31%, almost 32% say aggressively, 68% say in a balanced manner. Okay, what does this mean? A balanced or aggressive. When you ask them about the speed of transition, for most folks, it's between 10 years and 25 years. So Canadians as a whole, regardless of whether or not you're aggressive or balanced, for the most part, agree that we need to be adopting renewables within 10 to 25 years. So a fairly quick pace. And again, research would demonstrate that we're adopting at a much faster rate than we could ever possibly have imagined. So geothermal only accounted for 2% of energy consumption in 2018. I put a yellow arrow there. It's that little thin sliver of light green. Part of the reason why geothermal hasn't been a major part of the mix, either now in 2018 or even as we can imagine in 2040 on a go-forward basis, is because the largest barrier for geothermal is the cost. And 50% of the cost of geothermal is associated with the cost of drilling wells. So that's the primary reason why it hasn't been adopted at a higher rate. So what is geothermal energy? So I've got some figures here, and basically the deeper we go into the earth, the warmer the earth is. So if we can think about how do we draw up groundwater in a production well, take the energy off of that, the thermal energy out, and you can run it through a heat exchanger, or you can put it into a power plant and run turbines and create electricity from that. And then re-inject the cold water back down into the earth to be reheated. So that's kind of how a geothermal system works. The amount of geothermal energy that can be produced from that is between 10 and 300 megawatts of thermal energy, as well as electricity. So it's a fair bit of energy that's developed from each of those wells. So the amount of energy that you get from a geothermal system is a function of how deep is the system itself. So when people say, oh, I've got geothermal in my house, well, it's not quite geothermal, it's a geo-exchange or a heat pump. And that's between 1 and 3 meters. So if you look at this figure, that's the little house on the left-hand side, and not a very deep system. But if the deeper you get, like if you're going to look in mine shafts, or if you're like Iceland and you happen to have an island filled with volcanoes, you can get it off of the magma, heat off the magma. Or you can go deeper to 1 kilometer, 3 kilometers, 6 kilometers, then increasingly you get more hot water associated with that system. So geothermal energy, it could be heat, as I mentioned, or it could be electricity, depending upon what your bottom hole temperature is. It could be a heat pump, as I said, if you've got, the ground is about 10 degrees Celsius all the time, summer and winter. But as you get warmer, you can use a direct heating system, and it could be, you could have a greenhouse, You could heat up a swimming pool. The city of Grand Prairie spends $3 million heating their swimming pool a year. That's useful to be able to use heat even for something like that. Or you could do binary or flash steam electrical generation system. So it depends again on how hot your bottom hole temperature is. There are huge amounts of benefits to geothermal. So they've got clean energy. We've got small land footprint. Geothermal takes about 1/10 the footprint of solar or wind energy, so it's a much smaller footprint. It's energy and cost effective. It's renewable. It allows us to conserve our oil and gas, so we can use that for something like transportation. And it also allows us to have homegrown solutions that are fit for purpose, and the location could be a rural or even remote sites. So how cheap is geothermal? Well, if you look at the levelized cost of electricity, those green bars are the levelized cost of electricity for renewables on the top. The black ones, the bars, are for non-renewable energy sources. And again, I've put a yellow arrow there. And you can see here that geothermal is as cheaper than all renewable sources and as cheaper than any non-renewable sources. So geothermal is among the most economical form of electricity. It's also hugely reliable. It doesn't depend on whether or not the wind is blowing or the sun is shining or even if there's a fire burning. It's always there. It's always reliable, 24/7, 365 days of the year. It also has one of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions from any energy source. So again, we've got some various sources of renewables at the top and non-renewables at the bottom. It's as good as all the renewable energy sources, and it's 10 times better than any of the non-renewable energy sources in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So its footprint, its emissions are much less. So why am I talking about this? Presumably there must be geothermal resources in Western Canada, and the answer to that is yes. There absolutely is, which is great news. So this is a map that shows the gradient of degrees Celsius versus how many kilometers deep are you going beneath the surface. And you can see here, the red is good. We like red. Red equals more than 50 degrees Celsius per kilometer of depth. And you can see here that in northeastern British Columbia, into the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and then northwestern Alberta, and then down along the Rocky Mountains, we have fantastic geothermal potential, absolutely fantastic geothermal potential. So how much energy could be produced from this? So this is some research that's been done with Jonathan Banks in our group and Nick Harris. They actually looked at 10 different communities in Alberta, in Grand Prairie, around Hinton, Valley View area, Rocky Mountain House, and along the Rocky Mountains. And they've estimated that it could be as high as over 6,000 megawatts of electricity, which is effectively 30% of the current global geothermal installed currently. So Alberta has as much as 30% as what the globe has already. So that's a lot of energy. It's not something to be scoffed at. It's quite significant. Yes, there are impacts, and we should talk about those too, of course. What I do is I study risks. You can't just talk about the benefits. You also have to talk about the risks associated with it. There's exploration uncertainty. You don't necessarily know where the geothermal is. There could be concerns with regards to the cost of drilling and operations and management risks. But the nice thing about being in Alberta is, another good news story, we have 400,000 drilled wells in Alberta. That's a lot. What that means is these impacts are all mitigated because we know where the geothermal is. We've managed corrosion and scaling because we've had to deal with produced water. And we also know how to deal with all these other risks in terms of operations and in terms of drilling. We've already absorbed the cost of drilling. It's billions of dollars of investment in these drilled wells. So how many inactive wells? We have 400,000 drilled wells. Of these numbers were 2016, but now there's over almost 100,000 inactive wells in Alberta. So that's suspended or abandoned wells. So that's a lot of wells in Alberta that we're not currently using for oil and gas. So where are they? Well, as you can imagine, they're everywhere in Alberta, and they also happen to be where the geothermal potential is the best. This is a good news story, right? There's lots of inactive wells. They're where the geothermal potential is good. The next question is, can we convert abandoned petroleum wells to geothermal? And the answer to that is yes. So we have folks who are working in our team, Victor Liu in petroleum engineering, Jonathan Banks and Alex Hugh and others, have done work to then say, do we need to have a dual system whereby we have an injection well and a production? Does it have to be paired like this? And the answer is no, we don't. In fact, we can do it with a single well. And what we do is we have a thermally conductive casing. So what happens, and then you have an insulated pipe in the center. You put your fluids down on the outside, and as the fluid descends, it gets heated up, and then it rises through the center. So in that way, you actually have the thermal heat exchanger in the borehole itself. It's contained. You have no fluids exchanged between the borehole and the reservoir more broadly. And it allows you to then have continuous flow of heat out of a well, an existing well, and to be able to produce heat from this system. So we know that we can do this. We absolutely know that we can do this. And they modeled this for a well that was 3,500 meters deep, which is on average about how deep the wells are in Alberta. So that's, again, a really good news story. So what we're currently doing now is developing a Geothermal Atlas for Alberta. Germany has done this already, and they're already in the process of converting oil and gas wells to geothermal. So what we're doing is we've got all this geological data from drilling all these 400,000 wells in all these different databases. We're putting it all together in sort of 3D mapping GIS system, so that gives us the supply. We're mapping how the geothermal, the reservoirs behave, and then we're mapping that also in terms of population centers, different industries, farms, different communities, different other sort of uses, municipal uses. So that then allows us to map the supply of geothermal and also the demand for geothermal. And that'll then be publicly available later this year, so that whether or not it's a company or a community or a farmer, that person or that organization can say, can I make this work? How can I look at the economics to see if this is something that I could be developing? And again, that'll be later available in 2020 and publicly available, because this is publicly available information. So we're also working with Alexis Nakota Sue in terms of geothermal. Part of their land, south of Hinton, has fantastic geothermal potential. With a cool Institute for Advanced Studies grant, we actually took a bunch of folks from Alexis Nakota Sue to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. to understand Indigenous people's relationships to the land, to water, to fire, to air. Part of it is in how do they relate to that through their belongings, right, through their artifacts. And in taking them there, we had that conversation about their relationships to things and how do they understand relationships. On that basis, again, another way of thinking, another system of seeing the world. This is Alexis Nakota Sue in terms of how they consider the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And it's about how do you then create a balance? Can we develop a geothermal system that creates that balance within an individual, within a community, within a nation more broadly? And how do we do that? By understanding Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of what that balance in nature looks like for them. We're also doing work with Ross River Dene up in the Yukon. Again, they have fantastic sources of geothermal. This is us. We're standing beside a lake. One of their medicine men had a vision that they would be able to develop their community on the side, the shore of this lake. So on that basis, Jonathan Banks and others actually drilled a geothermal monitoring well in the place in which they could have imagined to have their community and what that community would look like. And again, that's a really interesting way of systems of knowing, because we took kind of their understanding of what their community is and their visions given to them by their ancestors of what their community could look like. And we used that to inform us in terms of where should we be looking for geothermal and what would that look like. We were up in Ross River in February of last year, and I told Lee Foote, he's a professor here and he runs the botanical garden for the University of Alberta, that I was going to Ross River to talk to them about geothermal. And he said, "Oh, I have a gift for you." I said, "Oh, okay, what kind of gift?" And we were sitting, drinking wine, and he brought this great big leaf, and he swooped it through the candle in front of the whole dinner party. I'm like, wow, that's pretty dramatic, right? And this amazing smell came up, and it was the smell of tobacco. I thought, wow, tell me about this tobacco. And he said, well, some colleagues of his had found clay vessels set aside 400 years ago by the Huron people, and they'd had seeds inside. And they gave these seeds to Lee, and they said, we don't know what kind of seeds they are. And they thought, well, we could do DNA testing, we could do chemical analysis, but Lee, being a botanical garden guy, he thought he should just plant them. So he planted them. And they came up, and they looked kind of different. We weren't quite sure what they were. The leaves looked different. But until they started to blossom, they realized it was Nkosi Anna. It was actually tobacco. So these seeds, these plants, were pre-European tobacco that the Huron people had been growing and had set these seeds aside 400 years ago. And Lee said, you have to take this tobacco up to Ross River with you. This would be a fantastic gift. And of course it was. This is a picture on the left here of us gifting this tobacco to Ross River. And they were amazed, they were astounded. And when we asked them, what do you want to do with your geothermal? They said, we actually want to develop a greenhouse, a native seeds greenhouse. So we can grow our own tobacco, we can grow our own medicine, we can grow our own food. And in that regard, it's really quite a fantastic gift when you can think about affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy and how that then fulfills all the other sustainability goals in terms of sustainable food systems, in terms of fair and equitable systems, development, meeting climate change goals. So in that regard, this is a fantastic project because sustainable energy means that communities can meet all these other goals for themselves. So thank you very much.